Many of us, lots of amazing sessions. I'm so happy to be here on this panel with a stellar lineup. And to start, I'd just like to get into it and introduce everyone. We'll start with Angela, all the way down. Angela Wachchuka is the founder and managing trustee of Book Bunk, a Nairobi-based organization dedicated to restoring public libraries as centers of learning, culture, and community. She has previously led Kwani Trust, East Africa's pioneering literary journal and publishing house. She is a director of the Nairobi Lit Fest, an annual festival which is hosted in Nairobi's public library, so it's a nice mix of both of your roles. And we're also happy to have you here. Coming down the panel, we have Yassmin Abdel-Magied. Yassmin is a Sudanese author, screenwriter, and award-winning social advocate. A former mechanical engineer, Yassmin has published 5 books, including the essay collection Talking About a Revolution, and 2 novels for young readers. She founded her first organization, Youth Without Borders, at the age of 16, leading it for 9 years before co-founding 2 other organizations focused on serving women of color. Yassmin is currently a trustee of the London Library and the Edinburgh International Book Festival. And most recently, she's on the executive committee of the Black Writers Guild. Lovely to have you, Yassmin. Alexandra Pringle has been an editor, an agent, and a publisher. In 1999, she joined Bloomsbury Publishing, where she was editor-in-chief for over 20 years. She is on the advisory board of the Bradford Literature Festival, and she is the founder of Silk Road Slippers, an organization that runs literary masterclasses and workshops in Morocco, helping writers refine their craft and getting published. And finally, we have DW Gibson, who is the author of several books, including the award-winning The Edge Becomes the Center, an oral history of gentrification. He has served as the director of Art OMI Writers in New York for 20 years, which is a residency program there. And most recently, he co-founded the Sangam House Residency, a writer's residency in India, along with his co-founder, Arshia Sattar. And that is our list of amazing panelists, and I'm so happy to be speaking with you. To start, yes. Okay, to start with, I want to get the conversation going by asking you how institution building begins, because you've all worked in your own areas and have created these amazing institutions for other writers to support them. So I want to ask you what brought you to the work that you do and what drives you to continue it. I'll start with Alexandra. As I said, you've worked in all imaginable fields around writing as an agent, a publisher, editor, a teacher, and now a writer as well. What's been the one thing that has driven you through all of these different iterations of helping writers, getting their work out there, getting their work published?
Just one word, really, passion. I started very slowly in terms of my interest in books, in that I was very late coming to learn to read. But once I learned, I was the last in my class, it was everything to me. And I failed at almost everything at school. But what I did was I read like a lunatic. And that's what took me to publishing. It took me to writers. And writers have just been at the center of my life. Really all my life since I learned to read. What I didn't expect was how I would want to take that forward as I came into my old years, and I decided that I should leave publishing after 40 years just before I hit 70. And I did that and stepped out into a world where I thought I have to use my skills and I have to do what I can to help people. And so founding Silk Road Slippers was a wonderful thing. It's a tiny, tiny company, I have 2 colleagues. And what we want to do is just give our skills to people who want to write. So that's not actually working with people who are published, although many of them have been, but working with people who want to write for whatever reason, and it doesn't even mean having to write a book. And it's that thing of the importance of stories in life. and how you transmit them and where you transmit them. So it's all about stories, it's all about people. And what I didn't expect was that I would end up writing as well. The only thing I haven't done is book selling, which I believe you have.
That's the only thing that I've done. That's lovely. Angela, I'd like to come to you. Could you speak about why you decided to do your work in restoring public libraries in Nairobi and why that work was important to you?
Sure. Thank you. For me, it was really about opportunity. So to give everyone a context on this and Nairobi and public libraries, so I've worked all my life in the creative sector, and that has been around publishing. So I've been surrounded by writers, by poets, by all sorts of people who use creative expression for all sorts of things. And in Kenya in 2003, we had a complete change of our governance system. We'd previously had someone in power for 24 years, and then in 2003, we had someone come into power, and for the first time in decades, at least in my lifetime, we were operating suddenly in a space where you could literally say anything and get away with it. So we felt very much like we had started now to exist in a space where creative expression was allowed, encouraged, or more importantly, it wasn't punished. And so opportunity for me in that space then became something I really wanted to pursue. I spent close to a decade publishing a considerable amount of new voices, primarily East African voices, but also eventually from the diaspora and the rest of the continent. And after a decade, we were looking for a space to host a literary festival in the heart of the city, because we felt with a festival that I was working with previously called the Kwani Lit Fest, which was set up by this fantastic guy called Binavanga Wainaina. He's passed on now, but he was everything. And we felt at the time that the gatherings like this that you're having in this kind of space, we didn't have these sorts of spaces in Nairobi. People were contributing their garden spaces, you know, you can come and do this in my garden, or you can do this in a restaurant. But because of that, it didn't feel like it was inclusive. And public libraries felt like they were a very natural space to have these sorts of gatherings. So then we walked into a public library, which is the oldest one in Nairobi, was opened in 1931. And the situation that we found it in, decaying, paint falling off the walls, old furniture stuck in the basement. It was just in a terrible state. Then began this conversation about what opportunity exists in existing libraries to make these kind of conversations and knowledge production and all the rest of it more inclusive. So that's kind of what informed my work going into public libraries. And since then, I've been running an organization called Book Bank, and what we do is restore public libraries.
That's wonderful. Wow. Yassmin, I will come to you. I was reading your interview online, and you have such an interesting quote. You said, "I love book festivals because they're like music festivals for nerds." I thought that was...
But was I wrong, though? Was I wrong?
No, you weren't. And so I just want to talk to you about, can you talk about why literary festivals are important to you and how you came to this work, where you're now on the Edinburgh Book Festival thing?
Thank you. And it's wonderful to share this panel with such, esteemed people from, I think, the world of, because being a writer is quite a solitary thing, right? And so spaces like residencies and spaces like festivals are the place where you get to meet your readers, you get to meet other writers. And so I often joke that the first time that I attended, well, it's not really a joke, but it is kind of funny. The first time I attended a literary festival was when I had published my first book and I was invited, right? So I didn't even know they existed until I had first published a book, and they were like, "Do you want to come talk about it at this festival?" And I was like, "Wait a minute, this whole time there have been festivals for people that like books? Nobody told me," because I was a nerd. And so I think for me, and that was 2016. Since then, attending festivals and meeting, if I think about the friends that I have made over the last almost decade, the majority of writing friends, the majority of kind of intellectual partners and interlocutors that I have had in my life have come from things like festivals, things kind of like this, right, where you meet people that are interested in ideas or in character or in creative endeavors of any sort. And that's kind of what I said to the Edinburgh Book Festival, part of why I wanted to be a part of that board was because I was like, this is a really precious thing that I was lucky enough to stumble into, but I know, as like a Sudanese diaspora kid growing up in Australia, that the other Sudanese diaspora kids weren't going to festivals, literary festivals, because they didn't know they existed, or they weren't speaking to them, and so on. And so I think that that was part of my desire to kind of step into the sort of establishment spaces. But if we want to go to something like the Black Writers Guild, or, if I may, when you talked about public libraries, the first project, and I haven't talked about this project for a long time, but you mentioned Youth Without Borders. Youth Without Borders was this kind of like unruly organization that I started when I was 16, because when you're 16 you don't know how to organize anything. But the mission of Youth Without Borders was to kind of bring people together to make things happen in our communities, to empower our communities. And one of our first projects was we helped bring 9 different organizations together in Yogyakarta in Indonesia to set up mobile libraries to go around, because the setup in Indonesia you could, if you wanted to set up a public library, in my mind I was like, oh, maybe you set up a building and whatever, and they were like, no, that's not how this environment needs the space. It needs something that can kind of traverse, the communities and so on. And so we ended up helping to bring these people together to, it was like boxes of books on the back of motorbikes that kind of went around the towns and stuff. And that was something hugely impactful for that community, but also something that kind of fit the community, right? And I think thinking about how we can also, when we're thinking about literary festivals or literary kind of movements generally, what does it look like to meet people where they're at, right? Not necessarily kind of build a thing and hope people come, but actually meet people where they are and say, hey, this is your need, how can we help fulfill it?
It's an incredible literary festival called the Palestine Literature Festival that I've been on twice, where you literally are on a bus going through the West Bank, and it's the writers going to the communities. And that, for me, was the most extraordinary experience going on that. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. On this note of community and sort of bringing all of these opportunities there, DW, I want to bring you in and just, you started off 20 years, you did a writing residency in New York, and then you brought that residency, or a version of it, to India for the Sangam. Can you speak about how you came to this work, and then what made you start a residency in India?
Yeah, and if I may just take 10 seconds to piggyback on the awesome library conversation, because I was thinking about it, especially in an American context, and I think libraries are one of the few spaces where the public is invited in and not expected to spend money. Yes. And I think very great value in that way. I kind of stumbled into the residency world. I didn't necessarily even know they existed, sort of like the festival thing. But I moved to New York when I was fairly young. I was 17, and I wanted to be a writer, and it was all about like trying to get access, right, to community and to support and to allies. And so I think I've always been driven by a desire to find that and to give that. And so I stumbled into the role at Ardo Mai, which was for many years known as Ledig House, named after a German publisher, Heinrich Maria Ledig-Rowohlt, who rehabilitated his family's publishing house after World War II by publishing writers from around the world. So that's the spirit of what's now known as Ardo Mai in the Hudson Valley of New York. We have 10 writers at a time living there together, working, generally speaking, no more than 2 or 3 are Americans working in English. Generally, the majority are working in various languages coming from different cultural contexts. And we emphasize translators because we like to sort of, our core mandate is to support literature going across languages. So in my second year in that role, I was so fortunate to meet Arshia Sattar, a fantastic translator of the classic Indian text, the Ramayana and so forth. And she and I got to talking late one night about how great residencies are and how inaccessible they are, going back to the idea of accessibility in so many parts of the world. Now, this is going back 18 years ago, and so many of the residency opportunities, not all, but so many, concentrated in the US, concentrated in Western Europe. And I was expressing to Arshia that when we could welcome writers from India or far-flung places, geographically speaking, the cost of travel was often prohibitive, and we couldn't cover that. Fully funded residency with a small honorarium, but we couldn't cover travel costs. So that was a deal breaker for a lot of really qualified candidates. And Arshia, living in Bangalore, said, well, let's do it in India. This was very late at night over alcohol, so I said, let's talk about this over coffee in the morning. And we did. We talked about it in the morning over coffee. And so we came together over the course of a couple of years and tried to replicate to some extent what we had shared together at Ledig House at RMI, but with an emphasis on writers in India. So at Singham House, we operate for 3 months in the winter. About half of the writers come from around the world, and half of them come from India, working in various cultural contexts, again, various languages. We don't own a property. We raise money to support the programming we do. It's all volunteer work. We partner with other arts organizations that give us space to do this. So we were in Pondicherry for a few years, working with a theater troupe called Adishakti. We were outside of Bangalore working with a dance troupe called Nitrogram. And now we're inside Bangalore proper at a place called the Jamoon, which has hosted many arts festivals over the years. So those partnerships are valuable to us too in terms of building community. And it's important to us to stay in the South too, where there's so much linguistic diversity, and to try to support that. Writers working in Malayalam or Kannada or any of these languages have a dearth of support around them. And so we try to provide that, and try to provide it for translators as well. We've built out translator mentorship programs as well, because you might have heard it's kind of hard to make some money as a translator.
That's lovely, because you've brought us to our next theme, which is about building communities that are inclusive. And I know that all of you have done this in different ways. Alexandra, you've been known to champion underrepresented authors. I'm wondering how that's changed for you or developed over the years as an editor, publisher, and now festival chair. And what advice do you have for others who are trying to do the same in their own institutions?
The funny thing is that when I look back, I realize that it was completely unconscious on my part. That I have always, for me, when I was 13, my father came back from Nigeria, where he used to work examining, and he gave me Things Fall Apart by Achebe, and I read that book, and it was as if everything in the world changed. The whole world shifted on its axis, and I never read in the same way again. And what I didn't realize was that, in fact, my mother, who never told us, was Moroccan. She lied about her. She never revealed where she came from. And my book is very much about discovering that identity. But without knowing it, I published looking outside of Britain, because that was what interested me. And I was always very interested in how people write in English from other cultures and other countries, because English is a very elastic language with a huge vocabulary that has only been benefited by people using it in different ways, and it's incredibly rich, and that I naturally went towards. So it was I have to admit, an unthinking thing that I was doing. And my very first job in book publishing was with Virago Press, which I was the fourth person to join. It was a tiny feminist book publishers. It was in the 1970s, and so for me, publishing was really always about changing the world and changing cultures. And that was part of it. And so when I joined Bloomsbury, I just naturally published looking outwards, and was lucky enough to publish people like Abdulrazak Ghana, who was very underappreciated for many years, and to my extraordinary joy won the Nobel Prize just as I was leaving publishing. But, and people like Kamala Shamsi, who I met when she was a student. She was finishing an MA. And so, but it was just a natural thing for me. I think that what has happened, which is so important, is there's been a massive cultural shift. Black Lives Matters was the important thing that happened. I wish that it was being absorbed by publishing companies in a better way than it is, but nevertheless, these things have to be good, and they have to start. But for me, it's small publishing companies that are the real breath, the heart of publishing life, and that includes very much small publishing companies around the world. And that is the way that we can really shift cultures and contribute. But I can't say it was a plan.
Well, it's made the literary world richer, so thank you anyway. Yassmin, you write for children as well, which is so interesting to me because I love children's literature. Can you speak a little bit about getting published and you're writing about sort of different cultures than you're publishing in the UK, for example, and which is so lovely to see. And can you talk about how, in your work with the Edinburgh Literary Festival, how you bring that sort of, desire for inclusivity as well?
So one of the things I often talk about with respect to children's, so two things I often talk about actually with respect to children, literature for young people. One is often when you ask people what their favorite book is or what book had the biggest impact on their life, it's a book they read as a young person, right? It's a book they read at about the age of 13, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It's this prime moment in your life as a human where you're like just absorbing messages from everywhere. And I was also a kid who like read voraciously and was just trying to figure out, I guess you're trying to figure out your sense of the world, right? And that comes from literature. And so it's also this great moment to be able to like smuggle in some pretty radical politics, right? Because frankly, the kind of politics, the kinds of things that happen in my books is that are aimed at young people are pretty radical, right? Like in You Must Be Layla, she headbutts the racist kid, right? And like within the second chapter. In Listen Layla, she like joins the Sudanese revolution, like kind of without really thinking about it because she just wants to get involved. I've got another young people's book coming out in January, inshallah, and it's like pitched as like a mystery magical adventure, but it's actually about how Muslim communities are getting kicked out of their towns and in the UK, for example. So I think there is a way in which you can almost not radicalize, but you can really like galvanize children and teach them about the world in a very kind of engaging and inspiring way, in a way that I think adults can be a bit, like adult readers can be a little bit reticent to do, right? Like I think often as an adult reader, you're coming in with your own like worldview and bias and baggage and experience and all these things, and so you read often through those lenses. Whereas I think as a young person, any kind of kid can pick this up and have their life change. So I think even though I also write for adults, I quite enjoy not only writing for children, but then also getting to tour, right? Because then you speak to school kids. I've been lucky enough, alhamdulillah, to take the books to kids all over the world, and they ask really engaged questions, and they're also very honest critics. Like if a kid doesn't like a book, they'll tell you, right? They will just there's a website online which is like a Goodreads for children, and they'll be like, this book was terrible, like just straight out, right? And I mean, in terms of kind of thinking about the Edinburgh International Literary Festival, or Book Festival, sorry. I mean, one of the things that we think a lot about is translation, like books in translation. What does it look like to have authors who write in different languages? But also, frankly, the communities program. So what does it look like? So this year actually was the first year we did screenings of our events in public libraries all around Scotland, for example, and in parts of the country that like have poorer neighborhoods and neighborhoods that maybe wouldn't be able to access these sort of things maybe at different times of day, because often a literary festival will have an event at 12 o'clock or 11 a.m. on a weekday, and most people are working or whatever it might be. And also some of our authors went to prisons this year to do workshops in prisons and so on. So I think it's thinking deeply about what it means to be inclusive and accessible, and also how do you kind of go out to meet people. But I think we still have a way to go. I'll be the first to say that the Edinburgh Book Festival is trying and has some way to improve, inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. Angela, I wanted to bring you in here. I was reading about how one of your goals with your libraries was to be focused and driven by Nairobi residents. And you conducted a survey to understand what it is that the Nairobi citizens wanted to see in their spaces. So could you speak about how to create this institution or your organization that actually benefits the people that you aim to serve?
Thank you for that question. It is, I think, one of my most favorite things that we've done in reimagining libraries. I don't know if it's the culture here, but in Kenya, often things are kind of handed to you from a government perspective without any questions about if you would like those things, how you might like those things, what you would like to use those things for. And so we really kind of wanted to change that when it comes to libraries. You know, library users just kind of belong to this magical group of people who are quite loyal to the spaces that they go to, but they're probably the people that no one asks any questions. You know, you're just kind of, it's assumed, you know, I've got 3,000 books that I'm donating to this library, take them. No one actually asks library users, what books would you like to read? What books are your children into? What other services do you need? So the very first thing that we did was ask questions. And to what both of you have spoken about, what it led us to, the answers that we got back led us to this wonderful plurality that libraries are supposed to provide anyway. Libraries are supposed to provide access actually as some of the best spaces that you can access alternative knowledge systems and all the rest of it. So one of the ways that we did that was listen to people about the kind of collections that they want. So when we're building collections, we ask, every single library has a wish list, and that wish list is from users. And so that has meant that we end up with a balance between what I like to call history with a capital H, so you have like your official archives, but you also have crowdsourced archives, crowdsourced memories, because one of the things that we've discovered through a project that we did called The Missing Bits is, you know, like history is contested, yes, but it's also plural and unfinished. And if you are digitizing collections dating to the 1800s, we mustn't assume that people who've been alive for the last 100 years, 80 years, 70 years, 60 years cannot contribute to that archive and don't have something that is so important that institutions can't teach you. And so with that plurality, what we've done is gone out to communities and asked especially senior citizens, elderly people, to give us their time, and we record them speaking about their memories about specific times in Kenyan history, and we kind of juxtapose that against the official narrative that you have. So it's this idea that, you know, with this comes plurality, and therefore comes a kind of plethora of all sorts of knowledges. The other way that we really pursue inclusivity is with programming. So we take the same approach. There's some programming that I confess we offer because we think it is necessary, you know. We run a literary festival every year, and we think that these are axis shifting times. So there's specific conversations that we will add to the program because we think it's an important conversation to have. But we also ask people what conversations they want to have, but also essentially what services they need. One of the things that this work has taught me is the public library is also a wonderful space and a medium to challenge what a public library is. So it's not just a repository of book collections, it can also be a service center. So we ask people what services they want. And because of that, we've ended up with quite a dynamic offering. These libraries are places that you can go to get access to mental health facilities. They're places that you can walk into to access digital classes. We don't call them that. We sell them as come and learn how to make the best TikTok of your life, you know. And they come. And what we've learned is that when you build it, people come. But also when you ask people questions, you make them co-creators in this process. And I think that's a fundamental way in which we have to design civic infrastructure and public life.
That is wonderful and very inspiring. DW, I wanted to come to you because you've run writers' residencies for decades now, 2 decades. What is the value of having a community as a writer? Because I think, Yassmin, you alluded to it, being a writer is a very solitary experience. And what has your experience been with all the writers that you work with, and even yourself as a writer? What is the value of having a community? And why is it important for writers and all creatives?
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately support, but what is that support? And I think encouragement, the word encouragement comes to mind. I think that what I'm looking for in a residency experience is an opportunity to grow. And I think that happens if you're getting outside of your own, not only your own isolation, but whatever your first sort of concentric circle of writer contacts are, right? So you can sit down at dinner with a bunch of writers in Mumbai or Brooklyn or Buenos Aires or whatever, and you're going to have a lot of the same conversations, and you're going to know what the pecking order is. But if you come to a place like Art Omai in the Hudson Valley, you might be the big shot in Berlin, you might be the big shot in Nairobi, but guess what? Here we all are, and we don't know each other yet. And so we've got to start from square one. And I think that equalizing factor is helpful, just in terms of everybody being able to, come to a place where they can encourage and support each other. But it's also the gift of time, too, right? So I think it's a balance between interaction with peers and growing through conversations you have and exposure to work that you weren't previously exposed to. Almost every night after dinner at residency, everyone goes to the room and Googles all the books they heard about, and all the movies they heard about, and all the albums they heard about, right? Because you hadn't heard about them before. So there's a balance between that experience and the quality of the time you have. And Alexandra and I were talking about this earlier. For those who don't write, it's very difficult to understand, I think, not only sort of the time you need, but the nature of the time. And to be able to walk into a space and have an institution say to you, okay, forget about meals. You don't have to think about your shopping list. Forget about washing. Forget about, all that stuff you have to think about every day of your life, and just think about your work. When writers get to a residency where I'm directing, I say to them, you've got 24 hours to use as you want. Use them how you want. Sleep all day, work all night, I don't care, but you organize the time and the way that it's most effective for you. This makes fundraising for residencies really hard, because fundraising is product oriented, right? And residencies are ultimately processes. They're supporting processes. Sure, there'll be a book, maybe it'll take 6 months, maybe it'll take 6 years, maybe it'll take a decade, right? So you're supporting the process. A lot of times when we're raising money, Arshia and I will explain what a residency is to someone who probably has a lot of money and has never written. And we'll talk about, what happens there. And Arshia will often say, you come and you can research, or you can draft, or you can edit what you've written, or you can sleep if you need rest. And I'm always like, Arshia, maybe you shouldn't say the sleep part. I don't know if they're going to give us money to let people sleep. But she's right. It's true. Sometimes it's about sort of giving yourself mental rest, giving yourself mental space to get to where you need to do that draft, or to do that editing, or to do whatever comes next in the process. So it's this combination of community and growth within that community, and then delivering as best the institution can the kind of time, the quality of time that you need to write.
I'm glad you brought up funding, because that's going to be my next big question. Now this is complex and difficult, because we're all trying to do things that work and actually, simply run. And you need money for that, no doubt. I think in the last few years, this discussion is more at the forefront of my mind, at least, especially in a post-2023 world, with BDS doing really well, rightly so, and writers signing on to cultural boycotts. Is it possible then to build independent, sustainable institutions without relying on support from governments, corporate entities, especially when the ethics don't match? And in the absence of these big donors or big sources of funding, I wanted to ask, I know it's a difficult question, what are some models we can look to for sustainable, ethical sources of funding while continuing the work that we all are so passionate about? Anyone?
I'll let you guys have the easy one.
I mean, I can kick us off, but I'd be very curious to hear what everyone else has to say. You may or may not be aware, but the Edinburgh Book Festival was has had a lot of challenges actually with funding, because there was a sort of big one of the big sort of I guess corporate sponsors was the target of quite a concerted campaign, and so we were in a situation. It was initially about climate change, and then it changed to become about Palestine. And I think it was one of these situations which I think was interesting, because from the board's perspective, the company actually did technically pass the ethical fundraising kind of bar, right? Like according to, it wasn't at the time, it wasn't on a BDS list or anything like that. And so technically, the board had kind of been like, it's fine. But it then became it became the target of this campaign. And then it was in a situation where loads of writers were pulling out. And it got to the point where it would no longer be actually functional. We could no longer run a festival if we continued getting money from this corporate sponsor. And so we then parted ways with the sponsor. It was sort of like publicly, it was a mutual kind of parting of ways. But it put the festival in this situation where we might not be able to continue running if we didn't find a way to replace that money. Alhamdulillah, we were able to convince, like really twist the arm of the Scottish government to provide a little bit of kind of bridge money, but that was for this year's festival. And honestly, the conversation at the board level is every single meeting. It's like, how do we raise enough money to be able to have a festival? And it is a challenge, right? Because you're not only just talking about what might be on a BDS list or not. Like the bar is not necessarily always about what's technically happening. It's also about what communities feel are acceptable, right? And the writers are a big constituency, and a writers' festival can't function without writers. And and often they want to kind of position themselves as on the 100% right side of history. And so you're kind of also dealing with perception as well as reality, right? And on the other hand, you have corporates that are like, why should we give you money if all we're going to get is our name, in lights, saying we're responsible for things we don't feel like we're responsible for, or just attracting attention that we don't necessarily want to attract. And so from the corporate side of things, we were also in the situation where, the company in question had supported quite a lot of festivals around Scotland. They then cut all the funding for everyone, right? And for some smaller festivals that couldn't actually operate completely without them at all. And I guess this is to answer your question. I'm not sure that we have, as cultural institutions across, say, like the UK, I'm not sure this is something that's been figured out yet. Alexandra's on the Bradford Literary Festival board, and that's also, you can speak to the sort of challenges on that front. But I think at the moment we're kind of looking at, okay, what's a mix between trying to get trusts and foundations, trying to get high net worth individuals, trying to find patrons and all of this sort of thing. At the Black Writers Guild, for example, which I was heavily involved in for a while, it turned into a membership model where, writers pay a subscription fee or a membership fee. Writers are not known for being rich people with loads of money to be, they're all sharing the same Netflix password, right? like they're not out here. And so I think this is something that we're trying to figure out. And I think in the times, like quite honestly, we're in situations, in the UK, for example, we're not in a situation where the government is looking like it's going to spend more money in the cultural sector. It's going in the opposite direction, right? We're not in a situation where the companies that are making more money are interested. I mean, frankly, all the big tech companies are trying to replace artists with, large language models. That are created off the art and writing that they have stolen in the first place. But anyway, so where we can find financial support in a sustainable manner, I think is like one of the big questions of the sustainability of the sector.
Yeah, I think it's only going to get more and more difficult, actually. So the Bradford Literature Festival I'm really passionate about because it's unique in Britain. In fact, in some ways, it's more a reflection of the festivals I've been to in South Asia, in that the people who come to it are across generations, across financial divides, across cultural divides, and it's truly inclusive and I think really inspiring. But it's a massive struggle to raise the funds, and the director, who is an astonishing woman called Saima, has managed to pull it off every year, but it's as if she has to be a magician as well as a festival director, and it's always terrifying, and we don't know until the last minute whether we can actually hold the festival or not. And you probably know Bradford it's got the largest Pakistani population, and maybe Birmingham as well, but and that is very reflected in the audiences. It's about the subjects that are discussed are history and politics and current affairs and world affairs, and it's not led by celebrity, and it's not led by authors promoting their books. So it's not funded by publishers. Publishers don't pay to take their authors there. Bradford pays. So there's a lack of understanding of how much needs to go into these festivals. Bradford looks outside of Britain for funding, and that's increasingly important. But I think that what I feel sad about with all literary festivals is that people, and actually writers are often very harsh about funding, and they grandstand about it without thinking how much they get from these festivals, how important they are culturally, and to their careers and their lives as writers. And I think there needs to be more understanding, really.
Yeah, that's fair. Anyone else?
See, we have a common problem. Seems to be prevailing problem across all continents. I think also that, okay, two things. I think that full independence in this kind of scenario is quite a myth, to be honest. I think the question is, what partnerships preserve your mission? Like, how closely aligned are you with the people who are resourcing you in whatever capacity? And so what we try and do, I won't pretend that we're anywhere close to solving this sustainability question, but what we try and do is diversify our sources so that we're not too badly exposed should things go left. We've got the unique advantage here of never having had the privilege to rely on government funding. So if we were ever to receive government funding in the future, that would be welcome. But this is not a source of support that we go to, at least in my sector, in my country, in my city. And so you try and diversify that base that you're talking about as much as possible to ensure that you've got a good mix between support that you're getting from foundations. We work with people like the Open Society Foundations, Ford Foundations, and like-minded institutions like that. And then you've got a layer of corporate support. That for us tends to be in-kind contributions, venue costs. Literally the cost of putting the light on. Do we need solar panels? Can they give it to us for free? Okay, if they can't, can I get it for 75% off? And and so on and so forth. So you're negotiating until death, basically. And then you've got individuals. For us, they've proven to be quite an interesting subset. Arts patronage in Kenya is not something that we have been able to track ever in an organized way, because there isn't really any kind of there isn't a reward for giving money to the arts. There's no tax rebate built into our tax laws or anything like that. We're only just getting to that now for corporates, let alone individuals. But what we've done with individuals in Nairobi has proven to be quite interesting. We called it the most glamorous night in Nairobi, and because we said so, we believe it is the case. And we just make them feel like there's a lot of FOMO that's going to be involved if they're not seen at a night at the library, which we charge top dollar for. I kid you not. I was surprised when we set the price and people actually bought tickets. And we started to sell it as this, kind of super glam night in Nairobi's oldest library. You can buy a table for you and your friends. Tables are going. You need to buy now. And we have sold out every single year, which has been amazing. But to say that high net worth individuals, even in economies such as ours, there will always be that kind of grouping of people, and there's a lot of potential to tap into there. So I think diversifying revenue sources, and this is in addition to whatever we can sell, we do. I mean, we even sell time. My co-founder and I sell tours and say, well, if you want the privilege of being taken around for personalized tours by such busy people, you've got to pay extra amount of money. So I think the key is diversification, and then aligning with partnerships that speak to what your mission is and what your purpose is. And yeah, just hope that with that kind of diversity you can start to get to a healthier bottom line. Yeah, but I do think that often, and I think because the language also, at least in my market, has become very much about, are you scaling, innovation, which there's nothing wrong with any of that. We make space for that in all the libraries, I have to say. But I think that often we lose the cultural importance of, of, of these things, of these festivals, of the civic infrastructure. And I would like to argue that some of these things must continue to exist whether or not they're profitable or sustainable. I think they serve such a great purpose that we must make a big case of support for them. And government institutions, for example, ministries of culture, must support these things, not because they're going to make money, but because they're fundamental to critical thought and all the rest of things that we need a lot more of now, especially.
Thank you. I really appreciate your candor. This is not an easy question, and I understand that all of you are driven by your passion for the creative space and for supporting writers, and we all, I think, feel that in this room as well. So thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for having this conversation with me. I just want to open up to questions if anybody has any.
Thank you very much. First of all, I welcome you all to Lahore, to Pakistan. Thank you for being here with us and sharing your inspirational stories and doing the great work that you are doing. I just wanted to ask, since we are talking about culture and this solidarity with the different cultures, and we have people from different cultures, of course, in the current development world, the people are very practical and pragmatic, and they want the solutions, they want the output from the cultural events in a very pragmatic and a practical manner. But usually, I'm sure you know that the inspiration and the output is not very practical. I mean, you cannot point out what we learned, what we did, and what the audience understood. So how do you deal with something like that, the expectation that the development world has and the donors might have to ask you, okay, fill in the forms, what did the audience get out of this, and why did we organize something like this? So I don't know if I'm able to explain my questions.
Well, so I think, so you're kind of asking around, like, if data isn't the most important thing, how do we build a case for support? Is that kind of what you mean? It's right.
It's not always tangible.
It's not always tangible. Yeah. No, I think it's a great question, and it's funny because we were having this conversation just at a board meeting I was at recently, where we were talking, a foundation or a trust, they kind of want data that says this is the impact, this is the improvement, blah blah blah. Which, if you're giving that money to malaria nets, for example, you're like, X number of children didn't get malaria. Why would you pay for that? Why would you not pay for that and pay for like a literary festival, for example? I think there's a couple of things, right? Number one, I'm the daughter of Sudanese parents. I studied engineering because engineering is a practical, tangible skill set. And if I had said to my parents, I want to be a writer, my parents would have been like, go be a writer in your own time, right? That's not a real job. And still, even on my wedding invitation, it said Yassmin Abdel-Magied, the engineer, not, like still. I'm like, anyway. But I do think there is something when you're in a context, and I'm, say in the Sudanese context, there is a hierarchy of skill set, right, around things that seem to be kind of under survival. And yet there's this contradiction that we love stories, that we're great storytellers, that we understand our history through stories and through narrative and through the arts, right? All of us will have music that reminds us of home and dances that connect us to a history. And so there's this contradiction, right? Because on one hand, there's this kind of visceral understanding of that importance, but it's not in the same kind of, frankly, capitalist bucket, almost, of like, what is the data? How do we prove it? Blah, blah, blah. So I think the solution to that, partly, I think, is in how do we shift the expectations from saying, in order to prove that something is valuable, we have to determine it 1, 2, 3 ways, like, and how can we demonstrate a different kind of value? How do we attach it? I mean, to be honest with you, it took me many years to understand my own value as a writer, because I was so attached to the idea of like data and like tangibility, right? But ultimately, if we think about the political context that we're in, what people need to know how to do is they need to know how to have a critical understanding of the world around them. They need to be able to tell the truth, the difference between truth and not truth. They need to be able to, engage with people around, like they need to be able to learn how to organize. These are not things that are data driven necessarily. These are skills, and these are the things that are intangible, and they are things that you learn through the humanities. They are things that you learn through reading, through art, through so on. And so, I mean, I'm sure everyone has a different opinion, but for me, I think with audiences and with foundations and trusts and so on, I think it is about teaching and bringing people on a journey to understand that there are different types of value, right? And not everything has to be, set to essentially what the market, quote unquote, or Wall Street or whatever it might be, might want and might understand. That's just a thought.
On the practical side, because we do have to make a case for support in these tangible ways and in intangible ways. And for tangible ways, it's very, we've seen great impact. We've had a 250% rise in library usage since we started working on them. And we track numbers daily, so we're able to say, this is what the numbers are looking like. But we've had to be creative alongside this on the intangible side of things. And one of the things that we do, for instance, is ask children to draw pictures about how the programming that they've experienced makes them feel. And we do submit that to donors as proof of yes.
That's such a good idea.
Yes, as an effect on children, We ask them what the library of their dreams is, and then we give them Lego blocks. And they build what that looks like. Now, that's not scientific, right? But it does give us new data because we're like, oh my goodness, we were not thinking about playgrounds, right? And when they built the library of their dreams, it consisted of all these things that we didn't know about. So, we can go into slightly more heavier M&E things, like what's your theory of change and all of this. But I think that we have to be creative with the ways that we're communicating value.
That's good. I have one last question if nobody else does. I just want to end this conversation by asking each of you, in all your work in all these years, what has brought you the most joy? This was supposed to be a very light question to end with, and you've all gone into existential crises.
Well, the first thing that popped in my head, lots of things. But I will say that we have a program called Translation Lab, where we bring translators who are working on a text, and they, for 2 weeks, are sitting side by side with the writer who wrote that text. And the translator gets to ask those 10, 50, 500 questions they have about this word, this sentence, this paragraph. And a lot of times those two individuals are meeting for the first time, and maybe they corresponded over email for years, maybe talked over Zoom, but this is the first time they're in a room. And I didn't anticipate how powerful that would be for a lot of people. Man, that's been a joy to see that happen again and again, and get to see people that have shared a text and shared a creative output, but get to be together, working together. That's been absolute pure joy.
So I would say, in general, it's been discovering new voices, finding first-time writers. There's nothing quite like it, and the joy of reading a manuscript, and it is an act of falling in love. But if it's somebody who has come from nowhere, and that you are part of the creative process, whether it was in my life 18-year-old Helen Oyeyemi, who was still at school, or Kamala Shamsi, who is a student, or Tishani Doshi, and there, that thing of that young voice, that first voice, not necessarily young, because like Elspeth Barker was in her 60s, whatever age, but that first thing. But the single moment of greatest joy, I have to say, was when I found that Abdul Razak had won the Nobel. Yes. It was just the moment.
That was a really good moment. Yeah.
Now, I thought I would leave Bloomsbury and they would leave him because his books were not really selling, and I was, knew that people would fall away. And when that, I just burst into floods of tears.
Oh,
It was amazing.
Oh, I love that. I think honestly, for me, it's the image that came to mind was when I get to read my work to kids. To be honest, I think for me, and to kind of, or when a child who's read my book, or one of my books, sort of comes to me and is like, oh my God, like this had, you know, especially my books all have Sudanese characters. How many books have you read with Sudanese characters in them, right? There aren't that many, certainly in English. And so I think it's for like young people to read Sudanese characters in the way they're like, oh my God, this is my world. I never thought that I would see my world represented. That to me is a selfish moment of joy.
A recent joy for me is that we work with, on average, about 40 to 80 interns and volunteers every year. And I don't know how much you guys have kept up with the news about Kenya, but we have been protesting a lot. Tragic outcome with some of these. It's just been really terrible. But one of the conversations that we ended up having with younger people was that Kenya has had a very healthy history of protest, and that is how we've ended up with some of the rights that we have. And it felt like there was a gap that the library archive could fill with this, because there wasn't too much information about the history of protest in Kenya. And some of the interns that we worked with, we then tasked with doing the research from the archive of this library, and they did such wonderful research and ended up with an exhibition that we showed in June at the Literary Festival this year. But on top of that, they produced something that you can all listen to. It was the third season of our podcast, which is called A Palace for the People. And the entire third season is episodes researched and recorded by them and focusing on a specific protest in Kenya in past decades.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been so lovely chatting with you, and it's been an honor to be on this panel, honestly. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.